After arrogant restaurant manager kicks out struggling father, Morgan Freeman teaches him a lesson he won never forget. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This restaurant has a standard to maintain and, well, you just don't suit that standard." The words sliced through the elegant air of the Golden Fork, a restaurant known for its exclusivity. The hum of polite conversation stilled, the gentle clinking of silverware halted. At the center of it all sat Daniel Brooks, a hard-working single father gripping the edges of the menu as though it might keep him grounded. Across from him, his 10-year-old son Ethan sat frozen, his wide eyes filled with confusion. Daniel had planned this evening carefully. A rare night out, a moment to make his son feel special. Now, instead of celebration, they were the center of unwelcome attention. Does wealth determine respect? Comment 1 for no, 0 for yes. A few tables away, a man swirled his wine glass slowly, watching the scene unfold with quiet intensity. That man, Morgan Freeman. And in the next few moments, the entire restaurant would witness a lesson in dignity they would never forget. It had begun as a basic father-son dinner, a rare opportunity Daniel could lay aside his concerns and simply spend time with his kid. From the time they entered, Ethan had been enthralled with the opulent chandeliers, clean white tablecloths, and waiters gliding between tables. Whispers of, "Wow, Dad," he said, "this place is really fancy." Daniel had laughed, combed his son's hair. "Just the finest for you, friend." He had, of course, meticulously budgeted every dollar, selecting menu items that would still make the evening memorable, but would not break the bank. Not seemingly, though, any of that counted. Richard Hayes, the manager, changed his attitude when he saw them seated at their table. It was first subtle, a tiny narrowing of the eyes, a scan up and down Daniel's clothes, a hesitant glance before he reached the table. That was followed by the confrontation. Richard had said tactically, "I'm sorry, but we have a certain clientele here." But his condescending tone made it abundantly evident that Daniel and his son were not welcome. Ethan wrinkled his face and looked up at his father, his naive mind trying to understand why they were being treated this way. Daniel stayed cool, to his credit. "We've already ordered," he said evenly. "Is there a problem?" Richard had a tight, fake smile. "It's just, we want to ensure that all our guests feel comfortable, and occasionally some people don't quite fit the ambiance." A few visitors changed their seats, obviously uncomfortable with what was going on. Few turned away. Some mumbled. Still, none of anyone raised a voice. Almost none, really. Because before Richard could say another word, a sharp, clear voice sliced over the tension like a scalpel. "Now that's an interesting viewpoint." Richard stopped. He headed slowly toward the voice and discovered he was right next to Morgan Freeman. The restaurant itself held its breath, and Daniel understood at that same instant they were not alone. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Daniel Brooks's chest. He had worked double shifts all month just to bring his kid to this restaurant. One special night where they could forget their problems and simply enjoy a great meal together. Yet here he was, standing before a restaurant manager with a smug sneer, being informed in not so many words that he didn't belong. Across the table, Ethan's small fists clenched his napkin, his young mind attempting to understand why his father's face had suddenly grown so hard, why the warmth of the evening had altered into something chilly and strange. "Dad?" he asked in a whisper. Blinking, Daniel forced himself to suppress the resentment boiling behind his ribs. Looking at his kid, at the innocence in his wide brown eyes, he realized he wouldn't let this night be marred for Ethan no matter what came next. He then looked back to Richard Hayes, the manager who now towers over their table, arms crossed in subtly expressed conceit. Again, Daniel questioned, his voice level, controlled. "Is there a problem?" Richard laughed a little patronizing laugh that informed Daniel his mind had already been made up. "Sir, as I said, we have a certain clientele here. It's not about affordability, we want our guests to feel comfortable." Daniel's jaw locked. "And you think my son and I make people uncomfortable?" Richard's smile never wavered, but something nasty lurked just under the surface. "I am saying that occasionally people do not fit the ambiance." The words hung there, laden with hidden criticism. The restaurant dropped into a tense quiet. Some turned away, pretending not to hear. Others exchanged uneasy glances, uncertain whether to intervene. A waiter moved nervously at the bar, eyes darting toward the altercation, but nobody spoke anything. Daniel could sense the weight of the gaze and the wordless presumptions underfoot. He had on an expensive outfit instead. His boots lacked luster from polish. Neither he nor Ethan belonged to the affluent clientele of the city, so to people like Richard, that was sufficient justification to drive them away. Ethan, still clutching his napkin, frowned in confusion. "Dad, did we do something wrong?" Daniel inhaled sharply, his heart twisting at the uncertainty in his son's voice. "No, buddy," he answered firmly. "We didn't." His concentration snapped back to Richard. "We've already ordered. We'll be paying customers just like everyone else here." Richard's expression didn't change. "I think it would be best if you left." Suddenly, that's an interesting viewpoint. From the far side of the diner, the rich, resonant voice resembled smooth-aged whiskey, consistent as a pulse. Every head in the room oriented toward the speaker. Richard's arrogant look fluttered for the first time. His body stiffened as he tracked the source of the voice. Morgan Freeman sat in the corner spinning a glass of wine in one hand. The great actor had a quiet storm building behind his intelligent eyes, a serene yet sharp stare. He set his drink down with great ease, then stood gently changing the cuff of his custom suit before moving forward. "You're saying this man doesn't fit the ambiance?" he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to make Richard hesitate. The eatery stood still overall. Richard laughed, adjusting his tie even though his confidence clearly wavered. "Mr. Freeman," he started, his voice suddenly more polite, "I wasn't implying anything personal. It's just that we have a reputation to maintain." Morgan slanted his head slightly and fixed his sight. "And tell me," he added, his voice subtly charged with calm authority, "what exactly is that reputation built on? The quality of your food or the quality of the people you choose to serve?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words emerged. Morgan moved forward, his very presence calling attention. "You see," he said, his voice never raising but bearing the weight of something unquestionable, "I've been to many fine establishments in my lifetime, and I've learned that the best ones aren't known for the wealth of their guests." Richard choked hard, his coolness faltering. Morgan answered gently, "They're known for the quality of the people running them." A buzz floated about the eatery. A couple of customers nodded silently in agreement. A woman seeing the events close to the bar murmured to her spouse. She said, "He's right." Richard's teeth clenched. He had begun this conversation with great assurance, sure nobody would challenge him. Still now, though, he was losing control of the chamber right now. Morgan turned to Daniel, his face softened, directly addressing him for the first time. "Sir," he said, "you and your son came here for a meal, not a lesson in class discrimination." Daniel nodded slightly in gratitude, but before he could reply, Morgan wasn't done. He turned back toward Richard, this time grinning knowingly. "I wish we could test this," he said. "Let's see if your reputation can manage a minor clientele change." Richard gave a scowl, obviously perplexed. "What are you recommending?" Morgan waved to the closest waiter. "Bring me a menu," he said. "I want to eat with them tonight." Richard clearly stiffened as gasps murmured through the diner. Things were not intended to go this way. Heads lowered in shame, he had expected the single father and his youngster to quietly go. Rather, they were going to sit across from one of the most revered individuals on the planet. Morgan's lips twisted into a little deliberate smile. "I believe we will be eating steak tonight, Mr. Brooks," he told Daniel. Still learning everything, Daniel nodded slowly. "Sounds fine, Mr. Freeman." Ethan, eyes wide, erupted in the largest smile of his life. The whole diner changed as Morgan Freeman settled next to Daniel and Ethan. Once full of critical looks, the tables now housed people whispering in appreciation. Now nervous but anxious to help, the waiter hurried to bring menus and beverages. "Additionally, Richard?" Speechless, Richard stood there knowing full well that his attempt to dismiss a man from his restaurant had just turned into the most embarrassing episode of his career. But tonight was different, not about Richard anymore. It centered on a father and his son seated across from a man who had recently restored their dignity in front of a whole room of people. And the great actor simply grinned and murmured as Ethan gazed up at Morgan with sheer delight. "Now, young man, tell me what's your favorite thing about steak?" And then what had begun as a humiliating night turned into a memory Daniel and Ethan would treasure always. Inside the Golden Fork, the mood had evolved drastically. The quiet murmurs of patrons permeated the space, their inquisitive looks straying between Richard Hayes, the once confident restaurant manager, and Morgan Freeman, the unexpected yet powerful presence who had lately reversed the tide. Still seated at his table, Daniel Brooks was trying to understand how the evening had veered so unexpectedly. Ethan, his kid, sat across from him, eyes ablaze with enthusiasm, still not entirely appreciating the weight of what was happening. Once hesitant before approaching their table, the server moved quickly and carefully laid menus in front of them now. It was obvious. The whole restaurant had changed its focus the instant Morgan Freeman had spoken. Richard pushed a stiff smile, but his fists closed at his sides. "Mr. Freeman," he started, attempting to keep his cool, "I assure you this has all been a misunderstanding." Morgan arched an eyebrow, his face cool but firm. "A misunderstanding?" he asked, his deep voice bearing a subdued power that made even the chandeliers seem to quell. "That's an interesting way to characterize what just happened." Richard gave a hard swallow. He said again, "I simply meant that we have a certain expectation for our guests." But even he knew the words sounded hollow. Morgan slanted his head slightly as though he were evaluating every syllable Richard had said. With his voice smooth but deliberate, "Tell me, Richard," he said, "what exactly are those expectations? That a father taking his son out to dinner doesn't belong here? That hard work and dignity are less valuable than a tailored suit and a platinum credit card?" The restaurant rippled with a murmur. Some visitors moved uneasily in their chairs. Others nodded gently, understanding the truth they had passed over just seconds earlier. Richard hesitated, his usually haughtiness starting to fall apart. "That's not what I meant," he said. "Then what did you mean?" Morgan asked, staring straight ahead. Richard went silent. Richard discovered he was on the receiving end of judgment that evening for the first time. For years, his position of authority kept him safe and let him act without thinking through consequences. Now, however, watching him, the whole diner was waiting for him to either defend his acts or own up to them. But he could say nothing at all. That he had glanced at Daniel and assumed he wasn't good enough for his restaurant? That a man's worth might be defined by the brand of his shoes or the label on his jacket? For the first time in his career, he had nothing to say. Morgan exhaled softly, shaking his head. "Let me tell you something about class, Richard," he began, his voice weighted with decades of knowledge. "It's about how you treat the people who can do nothing for you. It's not about what you wear. It's not about how much money you have." The restaurant was silent. Pin drop perfect. Though he realized there was no defense, Richard opened his mouth to argue. Everyone could now see the truth laid out clearly. Daniel, who had stayed quiet all through the conversation, spoke last. "Mr. Freeman," he responded with real thanks, "I appreciate what you're doing, but I don't want to force myself into a place where I'm not welcome." Morgan turned to look closely at him. "You belong wherever your heart tells you to be," he added. "No one, not a restaurant manager, not society, not anyone, gets to decide your worth." Daniel sighed, the strain in his shoulders lessening just a little. Still processing the event, Ethan stared widely up at Morgan. "Sir, does this mean we get to stay?" he inquired innocuously. Morgan laughed, his long laugh seeming both strong and consoling. "Not only do you get to stay," he replied, "but I believe we should make this a meal to remember." Morgan then turned to the waiter, who had been standing uneasily close by, unsure of what to do next. "We'll take 2 of your finest steaks," Morgan said easily, "one for Mr. Brooks here and one for me, and get the young man whatever he wants." Ethan's eyes sparkled, his former doubt replaced with unbounded delight. His eager question, "Can I have the biggest burger on the menu?" Another giggle came from Morgan. "You, my young friend, can have whatever you want," he remarked friendlingly. Quickly anxious to serve, the waiter nodded, then hurried off to enter their orders. Still figuring out what was happening, Daniel shook his head. "I have no idea how to thank you," he said. Morgan grinned, his gaze gentle but exact. "No thank you necessary," he said, "but if you really want to, pass the kindness forward when the chance presents." Daniel nodded gently, allowing those words to sink right down into his chest. Richard Hayes stayed motionless while the restaurant gradually came to seem normal. Once the man with all the power in the room stood alone, his power destroyed by a small deed of compassion. Morgan turned back one last time toward him. "I hope you learned something today, Richard," he continued, his voice neither nasty nor forgiving, just honest. Richard swallowed, his pride making a response challenging. He hesitated. Morgan gave a small nod. "It's okay," he answered. "The most important lessons in life are ones that force us to change. They are not the ones that make us comfortable." He went back to his seat then, leaving Richard to struggle with his own guilt. Daniel inhaled deeply when their dinner came, really letting himself savor the experience for the first time that evening. Already half through his burger, Ethan grinned between chews. He declared, "This is the best meal ever." Morgan chuckled. "That's the kind of thing I enjoy hearing." Daniel grabbed his fork and turned to look about the restaurant once again. The same people who had earlier judged him now watched with respect. Tonight, he was not simply another man attempting to give his son a memorable evening. He was live evidence that dignity is claimed, not granted, and he felt noticed for the first time in a very long period. Ethan slanted over and murmured to his father as the evening came to an end. "Dad, do you suppose Mr. Freeman qualifies as a real-life superhero?" Daniel laughed, combing his son's hair. "I think he's simply a good man who knows the power of doing the right thing," he remarked. Morgan grinned when overhearing. "Kindness, Tikram," he said, "isn't about grand gestures. It's about making the small moments count. And tonight was one of those moments." He then lifted his glass, therefore marking the evening as one never forgotten. The diner, which had been a platform for quiet harshness and judgment, suddenly hummed with another energy. The equilibrium of power changed the instant Morgan Freeman spoke. Now sitting with fresh dignity, Daniel Brooks had spent the last few minutes battling the impulse to just leave and shield his son from more humiliation. Ethan gleamed across the table, his small hands resting against his plate as he absorbed every moment of the unanticipated change of events. One man, nevertheless, remained stiffly. His face was pale and his power was erasing like sand through his fingers. Once haughty restaurant manager Richard Hayes had suddenly turned out to be the most awkward person in the room. Returning with their meals, 2 wonderfully cooked steaks sizzling on hot plates and a towering burger with golden fries for Ethan, the waiter reappeared. "Enjoy your meals," the waiter added, his voice noticeably more polite than it had been before. His prior reluctance had vanished. Ethan lighted up as he reached for his sandwich. With great contagious enthusiasm, "Dad, this is the biggest burger I've ever seen," he remarked. Daniel laughed. His earlier anxiety was releasing. "You owe it, buddy." Cutting into his meal, Morgan turned to check Ethan. Suddenly, the real question is, can you finish it? Ethan laughed, resolved to show he could. Daniel let himself calm for the first time that evening. This was about recovering a time nearly taken from him, not only about food now. Richard stayed around the cafe, observing the situation change. His face stayed blank, but the weight of the evening rested squarely on his shoulders. Richard turned away, hands closing at his sides. Things were not intended to go this way. His whole career had been based on upholding a reputation that guaranteed only the right patrons of his restaurant ate. One man, with just his presence and a few words, had so totally lost authority over the gathering. He inhaled slowly and deeply, then turned back toward the table. Not looking up as he noticed him approach, Morgan seemed to have had expected what was ahead and kept chopping into his steak. Richard opened his throat. Mr. Freeman, he started, his voice noticeably lacking the former bravado, I want to formally apologize for any misunderstanding that happened earlier. Morgan set down his fork at last, looking at Richard. Misunderstand, he said, his tone neutral but strong. Richard slowed down. Indeed, well, I might have misread the circumstances. Quietly listening, Daniel laid his napkin down and at last spoke. You did not misjudge the circumstances, he remarked straightforwardly. You assessed me, Richard blurted. Daniel spoke steadily, calmly yet relentlessly. You assumed I didn't belong since you saw a man in work boots and a basic shirt seated in your pricey restaurant. The comments really spoke to Richard, and for the first time he looked embarrassed. Still clutching his burger, Ethan looked between his father and Richard, his young brain trying to understand what was occurring. Morgan remarked, leaning back slightly, You know, Mr. Hayes, ultimately, it takes a strong man to admit when he's wrong. Richard let out a quick inhalation. He was aware he had rumbled. His behavior had been dictated by ego and preconceptions, and now he had to admit it while facing one of the most revered individuals on earth. He began, but the words seemed alien. He choked. Mr. Brooks, I should not have handled you that way. Once Daniel agreed to accept the apologies, he did not justify the behavior. He agreed, saying, You shouldn't have. Before Morgan spoke once more, let the silence calm you. Richard, he added, do you know what makes a restaurant really great? Richard nodded slowly. It's not just the food, Morgan went on, or the decor. It's how people feel when they walk through the doors. Richard nodded gently, processing the words. Morgan sighed and set down his napkin. Mr. Hayes, you have a lovely establishment here, but tonight you almost destroyed it. Not because of poor service, but rather because of poor judgment. Richard closed his jaw, but this time he stayed quiet. The thing about class, Morgan said, his voice like a gentle tempest, is that you show rather than wear. A few visitors mumbled in accord. Watching Richard intently, Daniel said finally, I came here tonight just to make sure my son felt unique, and whether I was wearing a suit or not shouldn't have changed that. Sensing the weight of the conversation, Ethan laid his burger down and grabbed for his father's hand. He said, Dad, you always make me feel special. Daniel's heart contracted and his throat choked. He gave his son's hand a strong yet loving squeeze. Richard gasped sharply, then looked down for a while before seeing back at Daniel. Again he apologized. This time it sounded sincere. Morgan nodded after briefly watching Richard. Then demonstrate it, he said simply. Richard crossed his eyebrows. What are you referring to? Morgan grinned, but his eyes clearly revealed something absolutely known. I mean, prove it. Make this right, not just for Mr. Brooks, but for every customer who walks in after him. If you really understand your mistake. Richard paused and then nodded slowly. He turned to look at Daniel. Dinner's on the house, he continued, his voice very clear now. Ripples of gasps swept through the eatery. Daniel blinked. He said, You don't have to do that. Richard nodded and said, I know, but I want to. Morgan chuckled. Rising his glass, he exclaimed, Now that's how you turn a lesson into action. The conflict that had enveloped the space had at last broken up. Ethan glanced up at his dad, his youthful face full of wonder, as the waiter hurried over to verify Richard's orders. Dad, Mr. Freeman seems to be kind of like a superhero, he said softly. Morgan laughed, his deep, familiar laughter filling the room around them. With a wink, he responded, Nah, just a man who knows when to speak up. Knowing that tonight had evolved into something far more significant than simply a dinner out, Daniel watched his son savor every morsel of his meal as the evening drew to an end. It was a course of instruction, not only for Richard, but also for others. Not only for the other diners in the eatery. For Ethan, a lad growing up knowing that dignity is something you hang on to rather than something given, no matter who attempts to take it away. Morgan Freeman had entered the eatery acting as a mute spectator. He had left nevertheless as a reminder that genuine class is about how we treat the least of us. not about riches, and Daniel knew that tonight would be one Ethan would remember for the rest of his life as he strolled out with his hand in his. The once tense mood within the Golden Fork has totally changed when the last plates were taken from the table. Where there had been judgment and exclusion, there was now a calm awareness that dignity was determined by behavior rather than income. Once trying to shove Daniel Brooks and his son out the door, Richard Hayes, the manager, now stood back and thought about it. He had given his power away himself. He had not taken it from him. The moment he understood that real power comes from gaining respect rather than demanding it, he gave it away. His pride damaged, but his heart lighter than it had been just hours before he turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Brooks," he began, his voice devoid of the haughtiness it used, "I misjudged you tonight, and for that I really apologize." Daniel looked at him for a second, then nodded gently. "It's not about the apology, Richard," he stated in a calm but forceful voice. "This is about what you do following it." Richard nodded in understanding. A man who had spent his career thinking that looks defined everything, now seeing that character meant far more. After finishing his dinner, Morgan Freeman set his napkin on the table and gazed one last time around the establishment. He understood that this was a moment that would linger long after he left the door, not one dinner or one error. He looked at Richard and said, his voice soft but weighted with significance, "You see, Richard, the real test of a man is how he treats the ones who can do nothing for him, not his wealthiest visitors." Richard lowered his head slightly, the lesson seeping in deeper than any admonition could ever allow. Now standing alongside his kid, Daniel extended a hand. Richard paused for a fraction of a second before grabbing it firmly, so closing a silent accord between two men who had begun the night as rivals, but concluded it as something different. Perhaps not friends, but no more strangers split by judgment. The small child gazed up his father, his heart full of respect as Daniel and Ethan approached the door. "Dad, you didn't just teach me something tonight," Ethan remarked, sounding somewhat proud. "You instructed everyone here." Smiling, Daniel squeezed his son's hand. "Nobody," he answered, pointing toward Morgan Freeman, who was observing them with a knowing smile. "We all picked up something tonight." The clean night air enveloped them as they emerged, and Daniel felt light, free, whole, first in a long time. Morgan Freeman waited for just a bit longer, watching as the father and kid faded into the city lights. He nodded satisfactorily, then looked toward the door. For his work here was done. This story helps us to understand that respect is earned by virtue. It is not given depending on riches. Our treatment of others less defines who we really are. Because at the end of the day, real class isn't about exquisite restaurants or costly suits. It's about realizing the value of every human being wherever they come from. One act of bravery may change an entire room.